Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. I have a question that has been asked several times recently and I thought I would create a video to answer it. And that is, how do you sharpen a dovetail saw? Now, I've shown how to sharpen a crosscut saw, but a dovetail is a rip saw. It is designed to cut with the grain because you're usually cutting in the end of the board. And it is a very simple cut to make, but with a dovetail saw it has a few little things that make it a little more difficult. So I wanted to show you basically how I go about sharpening a dovetail saw. So it doesn't matter what type of dovetail saw you have, even if you have a straight handle or a traditional saw handle, the blade should be the exact same thing. The one big difference in most dovetail saws is the number of teeth per inch. And most of the time it's between 20 and 14. Like this Veritas is a 20 and this Two Cherries is 14. And so a bigger tooth ends up being a little bit easier to sharpen, but the small tooth sharpens the exact same way. The only question is, what file do you use to sharpen the teeth? So to talk about it a little bit, the saw sharpening file is triangular in shape, but that's a little bit of a misnomer in that it actually has 6 sides to it, and one side right here is actually flat, and so each of the points have a flat face on them. And this is a very large saw file for very large teeth, and because of that, this flat point is actually a little larger than some of the other ones. When choosing a file for your saw, you want to choose one that has the appropriate depth of cut. And so what you're looking for is the tooth to come up just shy of halfway into the file. If it sticks over halfway, then you're going to be wearing out the middle of your file too much as you rotate it from side to side. So you want the tooth to only come up a little bit shy of halfway on the file. So here you can see that the tooth comes about halfway up into the file face. So on this file is perfect for this tooth, but if I were to go to a smaller file like this one and I put it in there, the tooth is sticking up past halfway on the file face, and that is a problem because I'm going to be wearing out the middle of this face twice as fast. And the middle of the face is really the point that is the most important because that is what sharpens the actual tip of the tooth. So how do we hold this so that we can use the file to cut the teeth? And really, for a small dovetail saw, you can use just about any 2 pieces of scrap wood you have and sandwich the saw so that the teeth stick up about 1/4 inch past the blocks. And then you can just clamp this structure into any clamp you have. Now, if you have a saw vise, you can use a saw vise, and that's much easier than one of these, but really there isn't too much of an issue with that. And so I'm just going to put this in the vise. So the way I do it, open up the vise, stick it in it, and I'll put a little bit of pressure on the vise. And I'll even up one end, and I'll even up the other end, and then slide it down till I feel good. And there we go. Now that saw plate is nice and tight. One of the problems with dovetail saws is that because the plate itself is so thin, it will actually flex as the file runs across it. And if it flexes too much, you actually start putting a bit of angle into the cut. For a rip saw, you want to make sure that the file stays 90 degrees in this orientation, as well as 90 degrees in this orientation. And we're going to roll the file a little bit to give the teeth a bit of bite. But we want to make sure that we keep it like this. If we flex the plate too much, then it would essentially be us turning the file, and that would turn this more into a crosscut, and we don't really want that. So the first thing we need to do is actually joint the teeth. And it's just like jointing a board. If you want 2 boards to then sit together, you want them to be perfectly flat and parallel, so that when they connect, you have an even connection all the way along the face of the board. With the teeth, it's the exact same way. So if you had 2 identical saws and you put them teeth to teeth, you would want every single one of those teeth to touch and match perfectly. And so we want to actually bring all these teeth to the exact same height. And I'm just going to do that with a standard file. You can get a jig that holds this at 90 degrees to the plate. I just like to pinch it between my fingers, just like that, and then let my fingers ride on the board, and that keeps it fairly well flat. I'm not putting a lot of downward pressure on it, I'm just letting the file slide along the teeth. And then I'm going to look at all the teeth and make sure that every single one of them has a nice flat spot on top. That flat spot lets me know that now all of these teeth are the exact same height. Now we need to sharpen it. And to do that, we basically get rid of that flat spot on every single tooth. So let's start with that. Now the first thing you have to consider when the file makes contact is how do you want to roll the file. And some people will say that the back side of the file closest to your hand, should be perfectly 90 degrees. That way the tooth is actually at 90 degrees to the wood. And I like to actually lessen that a little bit and bring it back about 5 degrees. That makes the saw a little less aggressive, so you actually cut out a little bit less in every cut. But in doing so, it makes it a little more gentle. It's easier to push, it's easier to slide through, and you're not forcing it as much. If the tooth is at perfect 90 degrees, you end up catching the wood and you have to kind of force it through a little bit more. And I find that causes more problems. So I actually like to put the file in and then roll it back so that the back side of the file isn't exactly 90 degrees. It's tipped just a little bit. Now one of the things I'm a little picky about is I don't want to push all the teeth in one direction. What that ends up doing is creating a burr on the far side of all these teeth, and your saw might actually turn because that burr is sticking out a little farther on this side of the tooth. So I'm going to start with the first one, and I'm just going to do one pass, and I'm going to see if that shiny spot has gone away, and it is really darn close. So I know that one pass should be about right. Now I hit that first tooth. Next, I'm going to skip a tooth so that I know that every other tooth is going to be pushed that way. Then I'll flip the saw around and sharpen every other tooth that way. So that was 1, 2, 3, and I'm looking at these, making sure that they're all looking fairly good. Now some people like to actually use a Sharpie on all of the teeth so that you can see what tooth you've done and what tooth you haven't. I find I really don't need that because once a saw has been used a couple times, those teeth fill up with junk and you can start to see the shiny ones from the not shiny ones. And you can fairly easily pick off where you left off if for some reason you had to step away. So now that I've sharpened every other tooth all the way along the plate, I'm actually going to pull it out and I'm just going to keep these tight, rotate it around, and put it back in. So I'm just going to do the process over again. I'm going to work again from the toe to the heel and do every other tooth again. And this way I'm pushing on the opposite stroke. Now I'm going the other side. I'm making sure that every single tooth has that flat spot disappearing on it. So I don't want to see that flat spot anymore. And that's how I know that every one of these teeth are precisely the same height. They all have a missing flat spot. Now once that's done, the saw is basically ready to go. The only other thing is that every 5 or 6 sharpenings or so, you're going to be sharpening down far enough that the set on the tooth needs to be redone. And what the set is basically the tooth sticking out farther on either side than the plate itself. If the teeth just came out perfectly flat with the sides of the plate, then the saw would have a tendency to bind as the pressure would all be against the plate. And if you put a little bit of set, so every other tooth then sticks out past the blade, then the fattest point is the leading edge, and so the plate itself can actually slide in behind that. You can do that with a saw set, and this is a fairly simple process. You just have to go all the way down one side, and what it will do is bend all of the teeth one way, and then you rotate the plate over again and you bend every other tooth the opposite direction. So every other tooth is leaning that way, and then every other tooth the other side is leaning the other way, so you get a slight amount. Now on these you can set how much of a set do you want. In other words, how much do you want that to lean? And for a dovetail saw, it should be very, very little. I've even talked to a few people who actually don't set their saws at all. They'll keep them perfectly flat. And for dovetails, that's not a huge issue, but I still like to put a little bit in. But really, that's something that I only do about once every 5 or 6 sharpenings. So it may be once a year with how often I do dovetails. The thing I like to test is how deep can I actually go on 2 or 3 strokes. And so Here's down to the plate. So that's just a lot of little fun. You know, how close can you get these together? And just enjoy the ride. You can make a whole bunch of cuts in a pretty short order, and a good sharp dovetail saw is just a good thing to have on hand. So even with a cheap saw that you could buy on Amazon, if you know how to sharpen it, you know how to take care of it, a dovetail saw is something that'll last you for a long time. It's not something you use a whole lot, and so because of that you don't have to sharpen it very often. But if you figure out how to do it and you learn the skills, it'll treat you well. So I hope you like this video. I've got a lot of other interesting ideas coming up, and let me know in the comments below, what did I miss? Is there something that you thought of or tried that I haven't seen yet? I'd love to hear about that. If you liked the video, please hit like and think about subscribing. Feel free to check out one of my other videos. You might find something you like. And until next time, have a wonderful day.